The Google video, I want to thank my guest Omega for coming on to chat about some of the things that we're going to get into today, and to mention as well that some of the esoteric roundtables that we had done previously, you have been a part of, and I really thank you for contributing with those in the past. And those have gotten some decent view numbers as well, and they're building slowly. So you folks can check those out; that are archived up there as well. And so. Today's subject is law and orders, and as is somewhat customary, we will talk about some esoteric orders and societies and esoteric groups that have formed throughout time, and kind of give a bit of a retrospective and kind of follow that into the future, and try to share and exchange some thoughts along those lines that we feel might be relative and interesting for you folks there in the viewing audience. And so just getting, I guess we could start, pretty far back into time with the idea of orders and how groups started to evolve along those lines. What do you think was the impetus initially that led to that?
Right. One of the things I really like about your show is how you spread from the far distant past into the future, and you get the whole narrative arc.
Well, as much as we can in an hour.
Well,
right.
Because none of these topics are isolated, and so there's a tendency to think of things in isolation, and especially with the Western mindset, we break things up into little pieces and try to systemize it. But in the old days, before there were orders, there were brotherhoods and sisterhoods, and before that, we were speaking before the show, there were shaman, and it was a very tribal world, clans. And now I'm thinking back 70,000 years, 100,000 years ago, things were very disorganized. And yet there were certain people who seemed to be able to travel between the worlds. And the cult of the reindeer shaman spread all across Northern Europe and North America. There's evidence of reindeer shaman all across the world. And so what were they doing? Were they alone? And in my mind, they were healers. And they were the people who were helping sick people, helping people when they died, helping people with births, leading the ceremonial fire at night.
Well, I would find that very curious that so far back you would find commonality, so far apart on the globe, at that early stage of humanity, that they would follow the same culture, the same patterns, and that this ranger shaman mentality would be prevalent, so far apart on the globe. And you wonder, how did that information spread? We've talked about the idea of a meme before, that things just kind of pop up in an archetypal sense within the mind consciousness of humanity, and that can spread in that fashion somehow, like just some kind of a systematic assimilation that gaps and bridges distance instantaneously. Or, obviously, the more linear fashion that we're normally considering, that information spreads, is taught from one person to the next and passes down in that sense, from father to son, along those lines as well. So, it's a point of curiosity that it seems at least universal that a shaman or a religious figure did emerge, maybe not as a group leader, but as a significant figure within, from the earliest points, and then continue forward. We still see the significance of that within society.
Well, they've done a lot of research just in the past couple years with the Human Genomics Project and the National Geographic, and they take swabs of people's DNA, and you send it in, and you get back a video. And there were certainly 3 large migrations out of Africa. And so humans have been migrating around the globe, for tens and hundreds of thousands of years. Simply, humans are more adaptable. We can live at the north, above the Arctic Circle. We can live at the equator. We can live near the oceans. We can live at mountaintops. And so as humans have migrated, they've taken this with them. I think also modern science is demonstrating that there's a basic human need for religious expression, for spirituality. What we think of as the universe being very rational and conscious, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Most of our experience is irrational. Most of our experience is spiritual. And we lose that, I think, in the modern world because we have all of our gadgets and our modern conveniences. But I think in the ancient days, when they didn't have these things, that people were really connected with nature, really connected with the divine world all around them.
And so that's one point I wanted to bring up as well. It seems like some of the shamanistic traditions do seem overly simplistic, perhaps, if you at first blush, but they seem to have, within the simplicity of their approach, and within, I guess, the relative quiet of the times or what have you, that they were able to pierce right into the heart of the archetype and right into what really makes us human, what is truly, the most innate, ingrained aspects of us that make us self-conscious humans, that they seem to have tapped into and still is, preserved. And we can even get at some point into the idea of the neo-shamanistic tradition and how there seems to be, a definite trend to getting back to some of this, people experimenting with some of the ceremonies and embracing some of these old ideas.
Sweat lodges.
Yes, definitely.
Healing circles, medicine wheels.
Right, yeah.
There's this whole idea that we're most truly human when we're born, and that we're these giggling, joyful, open creatures, and that as we get older and older and more conditioning and get sent to grade school, and there's bells and whistles, and we're trained to become good workers, that we sort of lose that thing. So the ancient people may have actually had a huge advantage over us. They had no books, they didn't have cell phones. All they had was hunting and fishing and gathering and enjoying life and really embracing the world.
Right, exactly. And I do think, I agree with you, they did have an advantage in some respects as far as that goes. Let's see, so I guess we can kind of start to slowly, take this forward and start to consider some of how the idea of orders and, from the shamanistic tradition began to become a little bit more specialized to the specific cultures.
Yeah. This actually is the most interesting thing to me, because you look at, you go to a museum of natural history and you see millions of years ago that the trees all had giant leaves and they had these big cells. Everything was simpler. I mean, the plants were simpler, the animals were simpler. And it seems like there's this evolutionary force, what the Kundalini energy inside humans is often called the evolutionary driving force. And it's not just humans evolving, everything's evolving. Dogs and cats are more evolved now than the creatures they came from. The plants have smaller, more complex leaves. Everything in the world is becoming more and more complex, even at the biological level. So I find it fascinating that our spiritual traditions have also evolved in a similar way. So my take on it is that there's a single human soul, and that we're all local presentations of one thing.
Or a fractured portion of a large soul.
We're parts of a larger whole. And in fact, maybe we're not even parts. Maybe we just are one big whole thing. But this whole thing...
Yeah, I think it's more of a perception thing ultimately, but yes, I agree.
And this whole thing, I believe, is evolving.
I see that.
And so we started off with just people informally getting together around the fire with some shaman. Then you find, say, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, a caste of professional shaman who became the priests of ancient Egypt, priests of ancient Babylon. Now you have suddenly people set aside, and the idea of a sacred space forming, and things become much more complicated, more formalized, more ritualized, and suddenly you have priests, and then you have brotherhoods forming, and they're more formal with more complicated initiation rituals. And then you get into the classical times, and I'm thinking Rome and Greece and Alexandria, and then you have orders forming, and it comes all the way up to the modern day. And of course today we have a very complex, lots of very tiny, small, specialized groups and cultures and spiritual traditions. I don't know where it's going into the future, but it's very different than it was, say, 10,000 years ago.
Well, definitely we'll try to get some prognostication before the end of the show as to where we think these things are heading. But it is interesting, and obviously we can probably credit to some degree the stability of these cultures and civilizations that, once they became fixed, established cities, obviously you could establish a temple, so-called, or something that would accommodate the priest more appropriately, perhaps, for the times. And the way in which the cultures also, I think, became perhaps exchanged more, perhaps. You saw Egypt and Greece, for instance. There was a considerable amount of exchange going on between just that, and that's just one example. I'm sure we could, think of others here as well. But that the orders or societies of the times did tend to exchange, it seems, and
absolutely,
and I think it's very interesting as well that took place in that respect.
So in my mind, I sort of divide human culture. I visualize culture as this flame that gets transmitted from generation to generation. I visualize this triangle that surrounds the flame. And the 3 points of the triangle, in a certain sense, are economic, social, and spiritual.
Yeah.
And so you've got these different components at play. Now, Marx, people who've studied Marxism, Marx's hypothesis was that if you looked at human history, you would see that economics was the foundation of everything, and that the artifacts were all economic. And in a certain sense, that's true. That was his hypothesis. But my research has led me to believe that actually temples and spirituality is the basis of human evolution. If you look back in time, what we see are temples and pyramids and sphinxes and all the ancient civilizations. These are the things that remain and have endurance through time. So, but there was definitely this element of trading and exchange, this element of exchanging gods and syncretization. They have cult centers in Alexandria where they have underground facilities for worship, and people had brought in idols and dolls and various objects and magical fetishes from all over the world collected together. The Phoenicians traveled around the world and were huge trading partners with all the different countries, and they traded ideas and they traded spirituality.
I think that is true, and I would get back to, again, the more archetypal essence of spirituality as, us understanding our true nature in relation to our Creator, or the nature of God versus man, God versus man. In that the temple, that does seem appropriate, because the temple in so many instances we see emulates the very makeup of man, and so if the temple is an echo or it's a recreation, rather, more appropriately, of our temple, the human temple, that does seem like that would precede, in many ways, just economic, the need for trade. And I mean, I know, obviously, the very essential need of food and shelter, things of that nature, but the spiritual relation, that, because man has always questioned from the very beginning his relationship, obviously, to God, and then, why can't I find the food, or why can't I find the shelter? Right. So again, hearkening back to that point, that archetypal aspect of the temple and the spiritual nature would make sense that would substand or precede the other things, and would be, more prevalent ultimately, or more important, definitely.
I do think that humans tend to project. Just a basic psychological function of the human mind is an element of projection. And so I think that the universe is very complex, and there's potentially fear, especially if you're in an agricultural society. There's this grand unknown thing out there. And so people have projected their inner structures into their temples. When you think about the relationship between humans and the planet, or humans and God, I see a scale of orders going outwards, like a musical scale.
Right.
And a temple for your community is, 2 or 3 levels out from the individual. You've got a single person, and you've got a family unit. Maybe you've got a multifamily unit, and then you have a larger social group, and then you have these communal spaces where you all go and worship and come together. And then even larger than that, you have like the whole culture, and then you have the planetary culture.
So I guess a harmonic, per se, would be...
harmonic progression. And a temple would be large expression or projection of human psyche. It's like a map of the human being.
I see that as well. Okay.
Yeah, we're in total agreement on that.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I think that ties into, the ideas of orders, trying to understand their relation to God, and trying to understand their part in the whole thing, the whole scheme of things, as co-creators, and that the building process does, progress as well. And I guess we could, one thing that I guess we did not yet get into, the way we will start to get into, and we've threaded now, I guess, is with laws and the bylaws that start to evolve through orders and through groups, and how that, like, I guess there was the Code of Hammurabi and things like that way back when.
Manu, we spoken that about.
Yeah, right, exactly, good point.
And some of these are formalizations, and I think that during certain periods of time, different social strata appeared, and also, frankly, there was a lot of invading going on. People from one section would invade another section. So these formal classes, you'd have caste systems. And so some of these laws and some of the rules and regulations and orders are simply there to separate people. I mean, there's this idea of what it means to be sacred is something set apart. And so you end up with a special group of people set apart from the community, and they're designated priests or Brahmin or shaman.
But I guess on the other end of that, though, you would have laws set aside that would segregate or separate, maybe the prisoners that you've taken in from some conquered nation, and they would have to start to establish rules and specific circumstances that would accommodate or allow them to assimilate into the culture as well, I guess.
Well, mostly they just didn't have any rights. I mean, ancient Greece,
yeah.
it's like, okay, you don't have any rights, and then you have citizens. And so Greece seems like ancient Greece seems like a very democratic situation. You look at it on TV, everyone has togas.
Yes, but you perceive of it as very civil.
Right, but you forget that only a very tiny number of people could vote, that most of the people were carrying water, chopping wood. And so you ended up with the emergence of rituals and formal initiation ceremonies. You go through an initiation ceremony and you come out the other side part of the group. We also talked about rites of passage where boys and girls were separated and had special rules, but then when you go through the rite of passage, you become a man or become a woman, and the whole society recognizes you as such, then suddenly you're bound by a different set of rules.
And it seems like the closest thing we have today would more likely be, as far as, generally speaking, would be the public education system, and then maybe the university system past that, as far as what's universally acknowledged and implemented. Obviously there are orders and societies that people can join in this day and age, but as far as universally and generally speaking, the educational system and that, I guess their cringing look, and the way I feel too, it leaves quite a bit to be desired as far as, an adequate and appropriate system for allowing that transition to take place, to really, really, really accentuate the potential in our youth and bring that forward.
I think actually in my mind, I don't think that the public education system fulfills that role. It's not chartered to do that. So in other words, our modern society, where we are today, doesn't necessarily have these rites of passage. And so you end up with Peter Pan syndrome, where no one has ever gone through a rite of passage, and so they've never been designated a true adult in their society. And so I think that's actually lacking. I think it might be a cause of some of the rootlessness or just a sense of isolation in modern society, because there's a lack of this rite of passage. In fact, I brought this book we've talked before, The Secret Ritual and Manhood in Victoria, America. And so America...
Mark C. Carnes with a C?
Mark C. Carnes. I don't know if that'll show up. Probably not.
No, that's a good
But Secret Ritual and Manhood in Victoria, America. And the hypothesis of this book, it discusses the growth of Masonry and fraternal groups in the late 1800s, in the Victorian age in America. The U.S. had grown rapidly, gone through a rapid expansion westward, and people also were feeling rootless. They didn't have these rites of passage, and so we had these immigrants coming in from all over the world. There's no common culture to go through these kinds of things, and people had a need. And so Masonry and fraternal organizations and the orders that we're talking about tonight actually fulfilled that need. And so I think that there's a definite psychological need for that, and people are hungry for it.
And so I do agree that we can see, for early societies, how, again, there's some sort of an archetypal, innate thing that wants us to, I think, ultimately cultivate brotherhood, a true sense of brotherhood in a real applicable, real everyday, where the rubber meets the road fashion, and not just in an imaginative sense. And that is, what I try to seek, to demonstrate on occasion, and what we've done with the esoteric forums that we've done in the past is, somewhat point out, as we're able to, some of these groups and show the progression and show the influence, and we'll delve into that a bit more as well. But definitely the rite of passage, it definitely seems to be lacking in society, and that's why, so many other things have, come to fill that void, video games and the like. And
also the initiation societies, the initiatory societies that were, the esoteric groups we're talking about, I believe fulfill a lot of that role for a group of people who go through them. Freemasonry, the Golden Dawn, the OTO, the AA, things like the Rune Guild, the Troth, pagan groups, Wiccan groups, Martinism, even I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has some for a small group of people who, become ordained.
Do you mean the Knights of Columbus, or do you mean some other aspect of it?
Well, both the priesthood and the Knights of Columbus.
Okay, all right.
But I mean, these kinds of organized, formal ways for people to go through a ritual and come out, designated with a special new role.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Let's see. Well, also, perhaps we could get into the psychology of some of the concepts that we find. We did speak earlier before the show about the idea of the Temple of Solomon, and that again, how does, if we talk about a temple or a building emulating our human structure and vice versa, and are these concepts actually real, or are these, psychological or mythological things from our past,
And I think that there's a tie into alchemy here, because the same question comes up with the alchemy.
Yes,
is
very
it
much
physical
so.
alchemy, or is it psychological alchemy?
Right.
So I guess in my mind, I think that what we have is polyvalency. Things are happening on multiple levels. And so I think that there is, at a certain level, a sense where people are physically building temples and physically trying to recreate King Solomon's temple, say. But I think the Kabbalistic idea of having the four worlds, you have Atziluth, the world of archetypes. So I think that there is, at the highest level, the archetype of King Solomon's temple. It's just a pure idea. And then you come down into the creative world, and so suddenly the act of creating King Solomon's temple in your daily life, in your body, in your group. Then there's the idea of the formative world, where you're actually forming the plans, which, and you take it to the next step. And then the fourth level would be physically constructing these things. In alchemy, you end up with like physical alchemy, the idea of psychological alchemy, philosophical alchemy, and spiritual alchemy. So I don't believe that there's one of these that's true that crowds the other ones out. I think what you have are things happening on multiple levels simultaneously. And it's alive. There's not like an easy answer to which plane is it actually happening on. I think that we can create models, but basically it's happening on many different planes all at the same time. There's an imaginal world, and then there's a real world. In a certain way, they're the same world.
And so, I guess the concepts that orders would base themselves on, there are different teachers and different authorities that somehow present themselves, or they become known of, and then groups will spring up around a personality, for instance, or an ideology. And so what would be the optimum relationship between, let's say, student and teacher, an authoritative, person or what have you, in relation to a group forming? How can we further flesh that out?
In my mind, when we talk about esoteric groups, I think in terms of mystery schools, wisdom schools, spiritual knowledge, the transmission of these ideas, like the transmission of spiritual knowledge, transmission of gnosis, the transmission of in the Sanskrit jnana, for jnana yoga, you have gurus, you have mentors, you have coaches, you have all these ideas. But I think at the end of the day, it's the language of leadership. And so, we start off with you have like the young people, they're unformed, and the question is, well, what do you do with them? Well, you can, you can exploit them, and sell them like cool toys, or you can, take the spiritual leadership and guide their growth in a way that's appropriate for their particular essential nature, or try. And so I think it's fairly plastic. I mean, I don't think that there's a infallible teacher out there.
Okay, so there wouldn't be a set guru formula necessarily either?
Well, there might be a guru formula, but it's not like the ultimate idea. It's not there's maybe an archetype spiritual teacher. I think in Theosophy they have
like Kutumi.
Mahatmas.
Oh, yeah,
right?
Kutumi, Moria. Right. Definitely, yes, very much so.
And, in yoga, we have like the ancient teachers, and I think these people become the ideals, the archetypes of the perfect teacher.
So getting back into the past, then, would we look at names of historical teachers as actual personages that had a group that influenced people, or are they in some cases mythological and this group or this idea or this cult has sprung up around, just the essence of the idea of this great teacher? You know what I mean?
Well, Aleister Crowley's concept, and he had taken it, I mean, he didn't invent this, but there was this idea of a magus, of a person who had reached a level of spiritual initiation so high that he emitted a single word. And so the typical examples would be Lao Tzu with Taoism, and his word was Tao. You had the Buddha, the word Anatta. You ended up with Krishna and Dionysus, whose words were Enri and Iao. You ended up with Muhammad. You end up with whose word was Allah. And then you end up with Aleister Crowley, the word of the eon being Abrahadabra, and the word of the law being Thelema. But the word of his eon was Abrahadabra. And so they emit this word, which is what they call the logos, and it's at a very high level, and it guides. It guides the spirits of the people alive at that time, and it forms a conduit for the initiatory energy, the connection to the divine spirit. It creates a current. Often, when they announce the word, is at normally a crisis time in the evolution of humanity, when there's an inflection point in the course of human events. And so it sets us off in a new direction, or changes the rules, tilts the playing field.
It's at least a catalyst for change.
Catalyst for change.
Wow. And so what would be the relation then to, again, the student to a great teacher along these lines? What would be the nuts and bolts, let's say, of how maybe that word emitting would affect them? I mean, how would they interact with that presentation of the teaching? Is this something that, I guess it at some point becomes ritualized and becomes formative and becomes repeatable within these different groups? But, I've just been curious. And then we have to at least consider to some degree the obligation, to the students from any teacher, and someone that's going to either willingly or unwillingly, have that type of magnetism to draw people around. I think that's a very key component too, that there has to be that extreme, inner magnetism, whether you want to call it personality or what have you. It's beyond personality, but that factors in, I guess, to a certain degree too. But that drawing, what draws people to this person? It's kind of the same thing in this day and age with celebrities, I guess, that are deified in that sense.
I see that there's two poles, and that depending on the particular person's essential nature, like your true will, you may take it one direction or the other, or go back and forth. But the two essential directions seem to be, on the one hand, becoming perfected as a person, and self-development. And then on the other hand, the opposite end of the extreme is becoming a conduit for transmission. So it's no longer focused on you, but on transmitting it to someone else. So the first obligation of a teacher is to create a new teacher. And that's one of the reasons why we have. I'm holding up Mackey's jurisprudence, and we talked about the charters and the bylaws,
right? Yes.
Penal codes. I mean, what are these things doing? Well, they're preserving the craft. They're preserving the chain of initiation. They're making it possible for people 7 generations from now to enjoy the same learnings and teachings that you received. And so, and this happens in everything from judo to yoga. There's one thread where you want to preserve the tradition exactly the way it is, because that way, several generations down the line, someone will receive it exactly the way you received it. And so, from that perspective, you become a fundamentalist, you become a purist. This is the way we do it in our tradition, and I'm going to teach it to you exactly that way. I'm going to teach it to you exactly that way. I'm going to ask that you then teach it exactly that way.
Right.
And it creates this chain that goes through time. On the other hand, things change.
That's true, indeed. We talked about evolution earlier.
Right. So the world is no longer the same world that our grandparents lived in. So there's room for changing things. So there's this whole other perspective, which I would call pragmatic, a pragmatic perspective of, we're going to do what works, and we're going to bend the rules.
Right.
But the point is that I'm going to be enlightened, and I'm going to enlighten people. And non-traditional ways, unconventional ways, and basically it's a yin and a yang. It's and you end up having to balance and equilibrate these two extremes.
And what about as far as any kind of authoritative aspect to a teacher? As far as what should a student expect? As far as having to give some level of obedience or cede over. How does their free will play into this? How does their individual will, their individual ability to discern and decide factor in within that relationship? You know what I mean? Because it seems like some gurus have been perceived as overly authoritarian and almost to the point where they're imposing, it would seem, their will on the student and to impress it to that degree. And so, that certainly has been one negative, I would say, a negative consideration of that.
I think that the concept we need to understand, and it's a difficult one, is spiritual maturity, and what the Buddhists would call maturity of mind stream. And so then what you end up with is, what is the spiritual maturity? What is the job of the guru? And then what is the spiritual maturity, and what is the job of the student? And there's different levels. And so some people need some authoritarian discipline in their life. Some people need to learn to be amenable to discipline. I joined the military when I was young. I had a need for some discipline, so went and joined the Army. Some people don't have that need, and they go off to college.
I certainly didn't. I felt that I need somebody telling me,
right?
At the time, anyway, certainly.
And so I think that there's different styles, and so what you end up with is, some gurus are authoritarian, and they will attract to them people who need, discipline and discipline and authority in their life. And then they'll simply, the people who don't need that won't go to that person. So I don't think that there's one answer for everyone. Absolutely not one answer. Other people are are much more liberal or relaxed, and they'll, the laid back guru type, and they'll attract the people who need the more laid back, the more relaxed.
What about the concept that at some point, if there is that right affinity or that a proper alignment between student and teacher, that at the student's level, he is assimilating to the teaching of his own accord because that becomes his very nature. His very nature becomes through ritual and his own efforts and desires and efforts along the path, let's say, to such a degree, and then within the framework of the teaching, that it just automatically blossoms into that teaching or some harmonic of the teaching in relation to the teacher without some without the necessity for over emphasizing authority on that student. They just automatically start going that direction on their own.
It's almost a cliche now with the internet and online, just, the memes that go around. It's almost a cliche of, a student has become the master, right? Everyone starts off really young, and so it does sometimes happen where a student comes along who surpasses the teacher. And so depending on the level of initiation and how much ego investment the teacher has, that could be okay, or it could be a really bad thing. Depends on...
Don't rock the boat.
Totally a case-by-case basis. The history of these orders are completely filled with clashes and schisms.
No
These things
question.
happen around because of this, because either one person perceives their status differently than it is. Another person perceives their illumination higher than their teacher. In some cases, it works out great.
What about within the context of society? How would a person in an esoteric order gauge their obligation to the law of the land, let's say, again, as we were saying earlier, penal, civil code or law, in relation to their obligations or any commitments they've made, any oaths they've taken, for instance, to any orders or groups? How would that play out? What is that dynamic?
Yeah, I think that life is highly paradoxical. Right? And that we're all confronted with multiple competing demands. So I think it happens all the time where your civil duty conflicts with your religious duty, or your family duty conflicts with your spiritual duty. Happens all the time. We expected this person to grow up and join the priesthood or become a rabbi or whatever it is they do, but instead they go off and and join Osho, Rajneesh, or they go off on some yoga quest or go to Peru. Who knows? And so, there's some disappointment there. I mean, the Buddha left his family. The Buddha was expected to become some, mid-level prince in a particular little principality, and he said, "No, I'm the Buddha. I'm going to go off. I'm going to do my own thing, totally eschew all of this stuff." And so, I think that there are no algorithms or rules for people. I think that's why it's essential that people know their true will, discover their true will, act on their true will, and take joy in the performance of acting out their true will. So I don't think that there's rules, and so there's bound to be conflicts, there's bound to be paradoxes, and these are the tests and the trials and the challenges for each of us that if we work through them, makes us better people. I actually have a point I wrote down in here amongst all these ideas.
Yeah, sure.
But my driving motivation, my current perspective of the week, because I change perspectives from time to time. But I'm viewing a lot of this as character development these days. Character development. People obviously have religious motivations or spiritual motivations, but look at what's going on here. It's people when they're young and they see the world and they want to mature and grow and be stronger, and what they're aiming for or desiring is character development. And so they enter these various paths, they enter an order, and they're confronted with challenges, they're confronted with trials and tribulations and paradoxes and multiple competing demands. And their job is to work it out, figure it out. And through that process, they grow. It's self-development, it's character development.
And in this day and age, with this hustle and bustle of society, the role of a disciple, so-called, or an earnest student within the context of having to, make a living and do all these things, it's taken, as we were saying earlier, a much more complex complexion, if you will, because of the fact that things are so much more simplistic. And obviously, people really had to really, slug it out to get their food and stuff like that. There was definitely some sweat going on, but it was still stiller ultimately. You didn't have the hum of machinery. You didn't have all the interference of electronics. You didn't have all of these things that compete for our attention, in addition to having to go hunt down our food at the grocery store the way we do these days. So, it seems like it's tricky business these days to try to ingrain these spiritual truths in a way that will allow us to be better people within society, when society seems to be just so, in many respects, anti that very essence, so mechanistic.
Yeah, I think I do think it's become harder. I think it's become harder just in the past 100 years. I think that people go through the educational system. I've been reading and studying Edward Bernays, who in World War I went and became a propaganda person for the U.S. and sold the war in Europe and invented the whole idea of fighting for democracy, fighting for freedom, and that's how they sold war bonds. So he was so good at selling war bonds, and he was highly decorated by the president. He came back and realized that he wanted to work for corporations, but he couldn't call it propaganda because it had this bad connotation to it. And so he called it public relations.
And that's ultimately advertising as well.
So they invented advertising. And the idea was, let's create consumers. Up until that time, people bought things they needed. Like,
right.
My shirt has a hole in it, I'll buy a new shirt, or I'll fix this one. Right? They didn't buy things.
That's a great point.
So when they came back from World War I in the 20s, the banks actually worked together with Bernays, and the multinational corporations were born.
Yeah.
And they actually invented department stores.
Yeah.
And they had these big showcases.
And think about how the Sears catalog and the Montgomery Ward's catalog came into being as well, as far as, the way of acquiring your Christmas. Because that's even as far as when I was a little kid, we'd get those books and we'd pick out our Christmas stuff. And so I can see that mentality completely, how that was born.
So they've created people who just want to fulfill their every need and fulfill their every desire and get whatever they want.
Right.
And they created, the me generation. Yeah. And they generated consumerism on purpose, just in order to keep manufacturing things. And so I think that our consumer orientation, capitalism has probably made it more difficult.
So is there theoretically or potentially a way or a means by which that mentality could be incorporated or infused into our humanity so that the ideas of brotherhood, right human relations, goodwill could supplant or supersede the material, mechanistic things that are in place right now? How do we sell and make viable, the idea of brotherhood and not just the idea of it, but it actually manifesting through some methods or some means?
Right. I think more yoga.
And that means union, and that's meditation, and
right.
that's
Meditation, yoga, and I also mean jnana yoga, which is inner knowledge and self-reflection, meditation.
Right.
I think esoteric orders. I think that these are good things. People, confront their fears. They meet their inner self. They do these things. Magic and the law of Thelema. I think that these are critical.
And so this is an experiential process then. This is not just something we would take on faith. We would have to actually work through these systems and perfect ourselves. And then, as you were saying earlier, and I agree, refine and tweak the systems as need be, as the times and the needs dictate. So I can see that too. And I think I've envisioned a time where, again, the esoteric order and maybe what's been held in a general sense within Masonry and maybe to the church, within the church to a lesser degree as well, the true essence of that can be extracted and can be, manifest in a larger fashion. And so again, these ideals and the building of humanity in a true fashion, so the Temple of Solomon, all these things that we said are archetypal at a certain level, can become gradually more manifest. And so, the shaping and configuration of the energies can be more beautiful, can be more complex, and can be more reflective of the true nature of creation, I suppose, that we can be a part of that.
I think the summary, like the bottom line, is the great work.
And that scares people. That title, that phrase has scared people, because I want to get back to this, and then we can start to tie these things together too. It seems as if there has never been a time in our human history that there has not been the strong influence, the undercurrents underlying the political movements and shakings. Again, economic, finance, how it came through the advertising thing we just discussed. It seems like, and many times that's perceived as a negative, in that the wants, whims, and wishes and the directives of these operatives are counter to what's good and productive for the masses. And there's a definite perception that that's taking place, that these groups are working, behind the scenes just ultimately to enslave. And so, how do we come to terms with that concept?
I can't deny what you're saying is true.
There have been cabals and coercions, and I mean, we can look at even the French Revolution and things of that nature, where we can see
I think it's true. I think that there's a lot of money to be made by influencing the masses to do, to stay calm, don't
keep the status quo.
Keep the status quo. Keep going to work, do all the stuff that you're supposed to do, and then retire, and that's the game. And if everyone does that, everyone's happy. But I mean, so doing the great work often takes dramatic changes in your lifestyle and your eating habits, in your consumptive habits, just all these kinds of things. And so it's not the message that they're sending out on the mass media. It's definitely an elite activity. A lot of people are interested in it. But very few people, year after year after year after year after year, pursue the great work with great diligence and the passion and the tapas, the fire, the fire in the belly. But I think people do. People need to find something that lights their fire, whether it's Tai Chi, or yoga, Freemasonry, Thelema, Theosophy, whatever it is that lights their fire, and it does that for a reason. And it may not be a permanent solution. But it's something. It's a way to develop yourself. It's a way to grow and just enjoy life, and not be a cog in the machine. To actually wake up, and not be a robot.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we can psychologically gain and truly physically change and accumulate a knowledge and a change of perception through, you know, rigorous application to these ideologies that are expressed and you know, been passed down through these traditions. We can embrace them in a real living fashion, and again, make that discipleship a kind of a part of our everyday waking life, and that we incorporate it into everything as a unified, you know, thing through the day. That the work, play, all our relationships would be based upon, you know, that desire for, I guess, again, you know, working towards some relative perfection as much as we can as humanity, you know.
Right. And, you know, there's many different words for this relative perfection as you described it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my take is that we're never perfect.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't always be trying to perfect ourselves.
That's a great point, yeah.
So we have to keep working at it every morning, every day, every
right.
breath. We try to perfect ourselves. But there's no end to the path.
Isn't it characters, is the building process you never finish or something like that?
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good one. I might steal that from you.
I saw it on a TV commercial, so sometimes they're good for something once in a while.
I mean, you know, I understand. I watch TV. I mean, we all do. I mean,
the cat's out of the bag. No, I hope that people watch a little bit of television, a little access from time to time at least. Yeah, exactly. You got to get the alternative take on things, you know, as best we're able to offer it.
Well, actually, you're doing a great service here, I mean, to the whole community, right? Because you're getting this out, and this is not your ordinary programming. I mean, we're not trying to dumb things down.
No, and the beauty of television is you have the opportunity to flick the channel if you're not interested. You know what I mean? No one's forcing you, so we're not trying to be overly authoritative. We're just trying to present a few ideas. And again, I think that, you know, we are able to speak a little bit with a bit of authority because you and I both have worked through systems for a number of years, and we feel that we can, you know, speak to the positive aspects of that, what we've been able to attain and gain, and how we've been able to, again, I think, help others in some respect. And I think if ultimately with these groups and these orders, if they're not, you know, at the root of the improvement process or program seeking to help others improve, then there's really, you know, there may not be a good seed ultimately at the root of that organization. So I think that would be, if I were looking for, you know, what is this group doing? What can I see that they've done? You know, and I think that's where like Shriners and groups like that have done, you know, publicly good work, and they lead by example in that respect. And I think that it has to be more so incorporated into this group work, that it's publicly demonstrated so that people can see, oh, they're not just sitting around, you know, idly theorizing and philosophizing about this great work, so-called. You know, there are ways in which we're actually, you know, physically carrying it out as best we can, or in the area that we feel able to do so.
Right. And I mean, there's some groups that are more authentically trying to improve things, both individually and as a group, than others.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, there's
I'm not trying to condemn anybody.
Right. But I mean, there's even like groups that are just open about it. I mean, they're the mutual aid societies, where before the rise of the modern insurance companies, groups would get together and just to, you know, collect money for widows and orphans, and just as like mutual aid societies. Right.
But again, I think that, you know, at the core of that is a need or a desire to help in the community.
Yeah, but I mean, it had a more secular aim. You know, it had more, you know, it didn't try to, you know, say it was something that it wasn't. Whereas, you know, some of the esoteric groups are actually more oriented towards the spiritual.
Well, and I think in that you can certainly find yourself involved with orders and groups that their goals are not so altruistic, you know, and there are plenty of those out there as well.
And, you know, and there's a lot to be gained even from joining them. I mean, just Toastmasters or Boy Scouts, whatever it is, because you're learning leadership skills. And so you're learning to
And I think, you know, that social interaction as well, the group dynamic and how to work within a group, I think is something that's going to increasingly become more necessary for us as humanity, because again, we can communicate instantaneously. Let me go ahead and squeeze in related to technology. Well, not those yet, but but the idea of the virtual temple.
Oh, right.
And how you know, there's a particular group, the open source Golden Dawn group, that they're primarily focused or centered online. There's a virtual temple.
Right.
There's not a physical locality.
And we've met these guys, right? These are
Yeah,
guys who come in
they're
town
from
for-
San Fran. They're very
Yeah.
quirky but really cool folks, and they were kind
like
enough
them.
to come down to Jeff Contreras' Western Mystery Conference
Yeah.
that took place in August and speak and present some information as well. That, again, and that's another thing too. The camaraderie that's is developing, I am very appreciative of as well. And that's one thing that I will continue to do, is to seek to break bread with other esoteric groups and other individuals that are affiliated with other groups, because that camaraderie, I think displaying that and actually seeking it out and working together, is only going to help establish that too.
Yeah, I'm a real strong believer in diversity, especially spiritual diversity.
Yeah, no question.
I mean, if I had my way, all these indigenous religions around the world, instead of trying to stamp them out, and, we would get people to embrace their own particular technology, their own traditions, and yeah, they would evolve and change with the new eon just the same way we are. But I think there's no need to pave everything over and just have what I call monoculture. There's no need for monoculture.
Yeah, no, we should partake of the buffet of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's just too much, good stuff not to, I don't want to say indulge per se, but to, experience. There's so much to experience. How would we want to do otherwise?
Well, let's talk about this open source Golden Dawn, right?
Yeah.
They have this idea of a virtual temple, which is in the Kabbalistic four worlds. We talk about the Atziluth, the archetype, and you have the creative world, the Bria, and the Yetzirah, the formative world, and the Asaya, the physical world. So this idea of having a virtual temple is obviously not physical. So probably it's in the Yetziratic world or the creative world. How high up towards? What do you see going on with the idea of a Golden Dawn virtual temple? We're talking about the vault, right?
Yeah, I see it as certainly a psychological tool, and also a way to collectively pool energy and to get that good stream of energy, and to vivify that so-called virtual temple, and again, to not the non-locality aspect of it, again, maybe lending itself to helping other people being able to partake of it by, they don't have to travel there, in other words. So you can instantaneously partake of and build upon and interact with and help that energetic, from wherever you are at any time.
I'd like to say there's a close relationship between memory work and the occult. And so the Romans, the Greeks, and the Renaissance occultists had a lot of memory work. And so this idea of a memory mansion is very, I think, cognate to like a virtual temple. And so they would build in their mind, like the ancient Greek and Roman orators would build a virtual mental picture of the amphitheater where they were going to speak.
Right.
Or you'd build a memory house or a memory mansion, and you would imagine your knowledge of chemistry is upstairs.
So a
into the
virtual Alexandrian library, perhaps, in a sense.
Right. Yeah. And so when I think of the Golden Dawn, it's got so much technology, the Enochian. And you just look at the vault, you see how much technology is there, astrological, chemical, Enochian. It's impossible to even go into it all.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have some more discussion before the end of the year on that.
And it's all converged together in this one area.
Yeah, no question. Yeah. But I think, and that's another thing too, we begin to identify the stream or the livingness, the essence of the group as we become more involved in it. And then, that becomes one of the ways in which we can test and understand when we experience something, if it seems to be in accord with